You're listening to the Haunted UK podcast, where paranormal stories from around the world refuse to stay buried. If you want to help us keep uncovering the unseen, support us on Patreon or leave an offering on Ko-fi. Now sit back, dim the lights, and don't look behind you. Holly had to begin to come to terms with the distinct possibility that the chances of her husband making it through this were incredibly slim. Everything seemed to be working against Eben, and in his own unconscious and comatose world, he was moving closer and closer to death itself. This horrific condition had burrowed itself so deeply into Eben Alexander's brain that even when the doctors were pulling back his eyelids and checking for any responses from the pupils of his eyes, they were getting nothing at all. The life support systems, which he was hooked up to, were keeping his body alive, but it seemed his brain may be totally lost. This is episode 71 of the Haunted UK podcast, and in this episode, we travel to the other side to listen to stories of near-death experiences. Every single day, we go about our daily lives and routines, mostly completely unaware that danger lurks around every corner. Danger that walks hand in hand with each and every single one of us as human beings. Innocent actions that we take for granted, such as crossing the road, can sometimes have devastating consequences. A trip, a fall, a car accident. All of these situations and millions more can lead some people to have profound experiences, near-death experiences, or NDEs. But these experiences aren't just limited to accidents. Everyday illnesses can also lead individuals to witness potentially life-changing experiences at the moment of death, returning with a renewed sense of purpose, a new message to deliver to the world, or to even completely change their lives to help them embrace the gift of life itself. Just like the alien abduction phenomena, many people who've had near-death experiences share a chilling number of coincidences within their accounts. The long tunnel, the bright light, the beings communicating with them, the warm, welcoming feeling of pure love and submission, actually wanting to hand themselves over to the other side. But what is actually going on here? Does science have an explanation for these strange, unpredictable, and sometimes horrific experiences? Well, yes. Many scientists and medical professionals who've studied the phenomena of NDEs believe that all the characteristics can be explained by the many complex and misunderstood processes taking place in the most amazing organ in the human body, the brain. But before we try to delve into the mysteries of the brain itself and the very frightening possibility that there is no life after death, let's first hear some of the best examples of the near-death experience. And let's see which side of the fence we end up on at the end of this episode. We begin back in 1979 in the southwest coastal town of Eastbourne in England. Jeanette Atkinson is in hospital, getting ready to go down to theatre for a knee operation. She's a healthy 18-year-old young woman, but nothing could prepare her or her family for what was about to happen. Fate was about to strike Jeanette in a most cruel way. Initially, the knee operation went well, and there didn't seem to be any problems whatsoever. But as Jeanette recovered at the family home, an innocent action by her mother would have devastating consequences. Simply wanting to look after her daughter and aid her recovery, Daphne Atkinson would massage the healing knee, thinking that this was helping Jeanette. But instead, it was about to develop into a situation which nobody could have imagined. On the evening of the 25th of January 1979, Jeanette began to feel very ill, to the point that she was coughing up blood. An ambulance was called and Jeanette was rushed to hospital, where her condition deteriorated even further, with her now struggling to breathe and in a huge amount of pain. But what had gone wrong? Her mother Daphne accompanied her on the journey and was with her as she was moved straight into intensive care for urgent treatment. But horrifically, Daphne was told news that turned her world upside down. Doctors who were fighting to stabilize Jeanette and trying to understand what was happening took Daphne to one side to inform her that it was highly possible that her daughter wouldn't survive the night. In complete shock, Daphne asked what had gone so terribly wrong and was completely stunned by what the doctors told her. Thinking that she was helping Jeanette by massaging her knee every day after surgery, she was instead breaking up a clot, which was a normal part of the healing process. In a cruel twist of fate, this clot was then broken into 7 individual clots, all of which travelled to Jeanette's lungs, 3 in one lung and 4 in the other, leaving her in a critical condition and fighting for her life. In most cases, just 1 blood clot is enough to kill someone, so an individual with 7 would seem to be playing hugely against the odds. As expected, Daphne was completely distraught and blamed herself, even though there was no way she could have possibly known the effects that such an innocent action would have. Minutes turned into hours, which turned into days, but somehow, in some way, Jeanette pulled through and survived. Doctors called Jeanette's recovery a literal miracle, as they'd never seen anything like it before. But behind the scenes, Jeanette knew the reason why she'd survived, and she knew the journey she'd been on, but she decided to keep quiet. Years later, in a private and personal conversation with her mother, Jeanette opened up about what had actually happened while she was lying in that hospital bed in intensive care. She said that even though she was under the influence of pain medication, as well as other drugs to help break the clots down, she was quite aware of everything going on around her, and after 48 hours of non-stop fighting for her life, Jeanette said she finally couldn't take any more and decided to give up. She noticed that above the double doors of the intensive care unit was a clock, and at the precise moment when she decided to give up all hope, the time was 9 p.m. And that is when the real story of what happened to her began unfolding. She noticed the light of the whole room began to shift to more of a warm glow, which she felt was surrounding her. The intense pain which had been plaguing her melted away, and she felt completely relaxed and at peace. She could finally breathe with ease. No pain, no struggles. Jeanette felt that she was getting better. Then, she began to float from the bed towards the ceiling. She turned over so that she was now facing the ground and looking directly at herself, still in the hospital bed some 8 feet below. Jeanette said that she then began to move along the ward, effortlessly floating along, looking at all the other patients still in their beds. Around this time, that warm light which was enveloping the room slowly changed again. The light began to fade, little by little, getting darker and darker until she couldn't see anything at all. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the end. But then in the distance, a pinpoint of light became visible. Very tiny at first, but slowly growing bigger and bigger. This strange combination of both light and darkness combined into a long tube, which began to rotate at a steady speed. Jeanette, still floating at the far end of this tube of dark and light, was completely relaxed and totally at ease with herself. This wasn't some sort of nightmare. This was the epitome of peace. But she wanted more of it. So she began to make efforts to move towards the light, which had now developed into some sort of stunningly beautiful light show. She was steadily getting closer and closer to whatever this light was, feeling the serenity and love that seemed to be radiating from it. And she was almost there, when suddenly she saw a form standing in the light, then heard a voice, completely crystal clear, say, "Come on, you silly old cow. It's not your turn yet." And as quickly as that, Jeanette was back in her bed. As if she'd been transported back into her own body, she found herself laying in the hospital bed, still focused on that clock above the doors, which by now was reading 9:20 p.m. Everything was peaceful and calm. Jeanette then made a full recovery and was soon discharged from the hospital and allowed back home. During this conversation with her mother years later, Jeanette became aware that there was something not quite right with her mother's reaction. She seemed a little disturbed rather than fascinated, and the reason for this reaction soon became clear. As Jeanette was describing the woman in the tunnel to her mother, it became very apparent that she was describing her grandmother in every single minute detail, even down to the voice. But Jeanette's grandmother had died when she was just 3 years old, and she had no memory of her whatsoever. So on top of this already amazing sequence of events, how could such a vivid image of her grandmother have made herself seen and heard to her? Many a skeptic may suggest that even at such a young age, Jeanette could have unconsciously stored an image of her grandmother from photographs she may have seen. Who knows if that was the case? But what is certain is that this is a very strange experience. As someone who digs into the whole paranormal spectrum with this podcast, one of the things I find incredibly fascinating is when an everyday human being whose personal beliefs go completely against even the slightest possibility of a paranormal or supernatural realm or dimension, then has a very real and impactful experience. Near-death experiences are events which happen every single day. But when one happens to someone who actually works in the medical profession, it makes you sit up and listen to their stories. Eben Alexander was born in 1953 in North Carolina in the United States. He was adopted at a young age and joined 3 other siblings in the Alexander household. As he journeyed through his education, he found himself following in his adopted father's footsteps and eventually became an academic neurosurgeon. Alexander's educational credentials are not to be scoffed at, as well as the institutions he studied and taught at. These include Duke University Medical Center, University of Massachusetts Medical School, University of Virginia School of Medicine, Boston Children's Hospital, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and even Harvard Medical School. Eben considered himself a religious man, a Christian, but not one who attended church every Sunday. In fact, according to Eben, it was more of a badge he would wear when it came up in conversation. He had no problem with people believing in God or Jesus, but due to his scientific background and what his profession had taught him, he felt those beliefs went a little too far for his liking. It was November 2008, and the Alexander family were one by one being struck down with heavy colds. His wife Holly commented at the time that when she heard her husband coughing one evening and complaining of feeling a little off, it seemed that he was also coming down with a cold too. Eben decided to go up to bed, thinking he was simply coming down with the common cold, but just a matter of hours later, at around 4:30 a.m., he woke up in excruciating pain. This wasn't a common cold. It was something much, much worse. Holly was witnessing her husband writhing around in their bed in absolute agony, having some sort of seizure. She desperately tried to get Eben to talk to her, to try to tell her what may be wrong, but it was becoming very clear, very quickly, that whatever was happening to her husband, it was incredibly serious. Holly called an ambulance, and it wasn't long before they were traveling to hospital. Upon their arrival, Holly witnessed her husband becoming more and more physically agitated and even contorted in his movements. Such was the sheer strength which Eben was displaying, it took 9 hospital staff to hold him down to get an IV drip into him. But then, Eben fell into a coma. Holly did her best to communicate with her husband, to try to get some sort of reaction from him, and even brought in their local priest to try to, and whilst they were both still at his bedside, Eben suddenly screamed out, "Help me, God! Help me!" He then fell silent. To all of those who knew him well, they were shocked to see this once vibrant person looking as if he'd had his entire life force drained from his body. The doctors at the hospital continued to do tests and discovered that Eben was suffering from a rare form of antibiotic-resistant meningitis, something that he would have had extensive knowledge of in his own profession as a neurosurgeon, because this type of meningitis was attacking the very organ that Eben had based most of his career around, the brain. The doctors who were looking after Eben had pulled Holly to one side and told her the bleak outlook that her husband was facing. There was only a 1 to 2% chance of him surviving this type of aggressive infection, and even if he did, the state of not only his brain but also his mind was incredibly concerning. Holly was completely devastated and broke down in tears whilst continuing to watch as her husband was being administered large quantities of various antibiotics in the hope that something would begin to fight this terrible infection. But nothing was working. Holly had to begin to come to terms with the distinct possibility that the chances of her husband making it through this were incredibly slim. Everything seemed to be working against Eben, and in his own unconscious and comatose world, he was moving closer and closer to death itself. This horrific condition had burrowed itself so deeply into Eben Alexander's brain that even when the doctors were pulling back his eyelids and checking for any responses from the pupils of his eyes, they were getting nothing at all. The life support systems which he was hooked up to were keeping his body alive, but it appeared as though the brain may have been totally lost. The surface of his brain was slowly getting covered with a layer of pus-type liquid, which was making its way into the fissures abundant all around the human brain. The meningitis was destroying the neocortex, the crust of tissue which the pus was now sitting on top of. The neocortex controls many things in the human body, such as sensory perception, movement, language, episodic memory, and much, much more. We need to put a pin in this because it will become important a little later on in our episode. Laying in his bed hooked up to multiple machines but showing no signs of life apart from what was being displayed on the heart monitor screen, Eben's strange experiences began. He said that it all started from what he termed the earthworm's eye view, a very primal and what seemed like a subterranean point of existence. It was murky, unresponsive, slow, and according to Eben, a very deep bass-like machine sound was constantly booming away from somewhere far below him. But things were about to get very, very strange. In this murky, dark existence, Eben became aware of a bright light which seemed to be bearing down on him. It then literally ripped a hole in the fabric of this strange world, and he began to ascend to an entirely new and different one. It was as if he was being rescued from this horrific existence. A type of music which melded choral and angelic chants began to envelope him as he became aware of bright, vibrant colors. Familiar plant life also began to appear, as well as a strange, beautiful young girl who appeared to be flying with him to wherever his final destination would be. He had no idea who this person was, but didn't feel threatened or at risk in any way at all. Instead, he said he felt completely washed over with unconditional love. It was while Eben was effortlessly gliding through this surreal world that he came to what he described as a place where an inky black core was emitting an infinite amount of love, but there was also a divine being, as he called it. He could feel it, but not see it. Then there was the orb of brilliant white light, which Eben said seemed to be something of a translator, who could enable him to understand the messages he was about to receive. He was told that his time in this realm would soon be coming to an end. He wasn't meant to stay there, and would be going back. In messages and teachings that had no known language to him, he was shown the role of unconditional love, the purpose of the soul and our consciousness in the realm of existence where they were at that moment, lessons of compassion, forgiveness, mercy. On the outside looking in, the doctors and Eben's family began to see strange things happening. He was getting better. Somehow, the brain was fighting the infection and repairing the damage. As the teachings from these beings came to an end, a very familiar figure appeared to tell him that it was time for him to return back to Earth, back to his body, back to his life. This figure was a young boy, who Eben later identified as his own son. After 7 days, Eben opened his eyes, defying the odds completely. Doctors were certain that given the damage that the bacterial infection had caused to his brain, he would never recover fully. But he did. Recovery was slow, as you'd expect from such a significant brain injury, but Eben Alexander did indeed make a full recovery. During and after the process of recovery, Eben began to write everything down that he'd witnessed during his coma. And even though doctors were skeptical about his experiences, they were certainly interested. But there was one small piece of the puzzle that still didn't seem to fit. And Eben didn't know why. Until around 4 months later. Browsing through old family photos one day, Eben became frozen in shock. Remember the beautiful young girl who was flying with him, who radiated that unconditional love? Well, there she was, looking straight back at him in a photograph. It was his sister, his deceased, younger sister. Coincidence? Or something else? When a person falls into a coma, or are medically placed into one, doctors use what is known as the Glasgow Coma Scale, or GCS for short, as a tool to measure the level of damage or injury to the brain in response to defined stimulus. The scale has a behavior and a response score of 3 to 15, with 3 being totally unresponsive and 15 being best response. The scale was developed in 1974 by Brian Jeanette and Graham Teasdale at the University of Glasgow Medical School and is still used today. To give you some idea of the level of damage which doctors feared had occurred to the brain of Eben Alexander, his score was staying in a range of between 5 and 7. 9 or below on the GCS scale is a coma. So in reality, it seems that having such vivid, colourful and detailed experiences in his mind during his 7 days comatose shouldn't have been possible at all. But that's not how Eben Alexander described his experience. So what happened here? Did a respectable neurosurgeon have an experience which seemed to confirm the existence of an afterlife? Or were there other processes at work here? Remember that pin we told you to put in at the earlier part of this episode? Well, you'll have to put one in here too. But again, we'll come back to these pins and we'll go a little deeper into why they're here. But for now, let's move on. We now travel to Germany to hear about a truly astonishing near-death experience. On the 24th of March 2000, Christina Stein was taking a car journey that she'd made countless times. She was a 19-year-old kindergarten teacher and was on her way to work. But this journey would turn out to be something completely out of the ordinary. Almost out of nowhere, Christina's car was hit by a large truck, which struck her on the driver's side and proceeded to push her car into a ditch at the side of the road. If that wasn't already bad enough, Christina watched in absolute horror as the truck then followed her into the ditch, landing on top of her car and crushing it. Witnesses quickly alerted the emergency services, who upon arrival were shocked by the scene which they now faced. The first mammoth task was to remove the truck from the ditch so that they could at least see the damage to the car underneath it, but more importantly, to see if the driver was even still alive. Christina was in a terrible situation with a series of life-threatening injuries, so the clock was ticking, and it wasn't ticking in her favor. After a battle of almost an hour and a half, the emergency services had finally cut Christina out of her car, but her journey was just beginning. Upon arriving at the hospital, doctors were faced with the huge task of cataloguing her injuries and coming up with a plan of treatment. She'd suffered severe internal bleeding, and doctors were stunned by the fact that she was even still alive. However, the battle had only just started. Surgeons were performing an emergency open-heart procedure to try to stop the internal bleeding, but just as they thought they were making progress, Christina's heart stopped beating. Her injuries were terrible. Her aorta was severely torn, as was one of her lungs, and on top of that, she'd ruptured her spleen. Amazingly, doctors managed to get her heart beating again and stabilized her condition. After just 1 month, she left hospital. A literal miracle. But things weren't over for Christina yet. Shortly after leaving hospital, her aorta ruptured, which meant that she had to have another emergency surgery. Christina's body was opened back up, and her surgery was going as planned, until her heart stopped beating. Multiple attempts were made to restart her heart, but it was no good. To the doctors around her, Christina was now clinically dead. But little did they know, her mind was in overdrive, and for her, things were about to get very strange. In almost a split-second flash, she found herself floating above her body and towards the ceiling. As she became still, she had a full and uninterrupted view of the surgeons working frantically on her body below. She could even hear their conversations, and from what she could make out, she was in a real life-or-death situation. Christina heard medical terms being used in the desperate conversations that were taking place between the doctors who were trying so hard to save her. She watched as they operated on her through her open ribcage, and she even remembered a particular name that they used for her as they fought against the odds that were steadily stacking up against her. They called her the Little One. "Come on," she heard them say. "We have to get this little one through this." She then noticed 2 people in the room who were beckoning to her to come down and follow them. She said she knew these people, but had never met them in her life, apart from one of them holding her when she was a baby. It was her deceased grandparents. Christina had only seen them in photographs and had never met her grandmother, as she'd passed away before she was born. Her grandfather was the one who held her as a baby, but he also passed away not long after, so she had little to no memory of them at all, yet she knew who they were, and they knew who she was. She greeted them and walked between them as they led her from the hospital and to a place of peace and happiness. She noticed that she was now wearing a light cotton blue dress and no shoes, and she even remembered the surface that she was walking on, which felt like cotton wool. Her grandparents continued to talk to her, making her feel comfortable, safe, and welcomed. But it was also explained to Christina that this wasn't her time. She couldn't stay in this realm with them. She had to go back to fulfill a purpose, yet she had no idea what that was. Christina mentioned that this resulted in her beginning to cry, not out of sadness or anger, but out of joy and happiness, that she was able to meet her grandparents. As the time passed, she was slowly led back to the hospital where she saw her parents and other relatives who'd gathered in a waiting room. She could see how upset they were, how they were crying and supporting each other. Then, as if in some sort of strange transitional moment, she was beginning to wake up from the anesthetic. Christina had been clinically dead for 22 minutes, and in that whole time, she felt that she was experiencing her NDE. But where was the evidence to support what she'd witnessed? Well, the surgeons actually witnessed her crying in surgery. They admitted that they saw tears running down her cheeks as they fought to save her. Christina got to speak to them even more during subsequent checkup appointments, and they were stunned when she mentioned that she heard them call her the little one. She spoke to them in detail about her NDE, and surprisingly for her, the surgeons seemed to believe her, saying that it wasn't the first time they'd heard similar stories. Christina went on to write a book about her NDE and has made numerous television appearances to speak about her experience, but she has never gone out to purposely seek fame or fortune. She found strength in her faith in God and began to live a better and more positive life. And this is something that she has passed on to her children. And in October 2021, she went back into hospital for another open-heart surgical procedure. During a routine checkup, an aneurysm was discovered which had formed around the suture point of the rupture in her aorta. It took a while to find a surgeon who was willing to take on this very risky and dangerous operation, but as Christina said, she had the protection of 1,000 angels, and also a very skilled surgeon. The operation was a success, and she is still living life to the fullest. We now come back to the UK and to a hike to the top of one of the highest mountains in Scotland, Derry Cairngorm. Standing alongside Ben Macdui and others, Derry Cairngorm is just shy of 4,000 feet and forms part of the Cairngorm mountain range. It goes without saying that the Cairngorms are a hugely popular tourist destination all year round, but in the winter months, the mountains can see weather fronts roll in which are comparable to those seen in the Arctic, and they can, and sometimes do, prove to be fatal. In February 1994, Jackie Greaves and two friends had planned to hike to the summit of Derry Cairngorm. An early start was crucial if they were to make the summit, and the weather looked very good for the time of year. Now, it must be specified that not only Jackie, but also her two companions were seasoned hikers and climbers with decades of experience between the three of them. It wasn't as though they were going to do something outside of their comfort zone. The morning of the climb was going well, and they were making good progress, but the weather quickly turned in the early afternoon, and the trio found themselves in trouble. Heavy snow started to fall, with high winds rolling in. These were now whiteout conditions, and none of the group were roped together. They were walking on the summit ridge when Jackie lost sight of her companions and had no idea where they were. The weather conditions were also making it impossible for Jackie to know exactly where she was, and as she continued to try and find her friends, as well as sure footing, disaster struck. What Jackie didn't realize was that her two other climbing companions were right by her, and they'd all strayed onto a cornice, a snow overhang or ledge which suddenly gave way, plunging all three of them hundreds of feet down the mountain. Whilst her companions Bruce Nutter and David Corley had a relatively safe landing, Jackie wasn't so fortunate. It was only her quick thinking and her ice axe that brought her to a stop down a gully, but she wasn't out of trouble by any means. She'd landed on a small ledge, approximately 12 inches wide, with no clue what was below her. The storm was still raging, so she decided to get her survival bag out and climb into her plastic shelter sleeve. She also grabbed her whistle and began to blow into it, hoping that someone would hear her. As the evening drew in and darkness fell, a phone began ringing at the headquarters of the Braemar Mountain Rescue Association. It was one of Jackie's climbing companions reporting what had happened. A team was quickly put together, and they headed towards Derry Lodge Mountain Cabin where the call had come from. On the way, they encountered Jackie's other climbing companions, but neither of them had any idea where she was, or if she was even still alive. Temperatures on the mountain can drop as low as minus 30 degrees centigrade, so it was imperative that the mountain rescue team find her as soon as possible. As Jackie lay slowly freezing, she saw a number of red and white lights in the distance. This was the mountain rescue team with their flares and torches coming towards her. But then, to her horror, they started to move away from her in a different direction. Due to the weather conditions and their fall, Bruce and David had mistakenly directed the rescue team to the wrong location. Jackie was completely distraught, but even as she was watching all of this take place, as the rescue team disappeared into the darkness, something was helping Jackie stay focused. Something was with her. Shortly after the fall, she noticed a bright light above her, and this light stayed there all through the night, keeping Jackie company, watching over her, removing the fear and anxiety from the whole situation. She felt comfortable, safe. The light was way too bright to be a star, and it would have been impossible to have seen stars because of the blizzard which was raging all around her. So what was it? And how was it staying in one position? As morning broke, the light seemed to disappear, but Jackie was still faced with the prospect of getting down the mountain. So, incredibly cold, she removed her gloves and began to ease herself down the gully which she'd been stuck on. The descent was energy zapping, and Jackie found herself completely exhausted and in the middle of more whiteout conditions. It's bad enough being caught in this type of weather during the night, but in the day, every single step taken is not to be trusted. Everything in your vision is completely white. The floor, the sky, everything. As Jackie continued to walk in a literal blind state, a railway-level crossing barrier suddenly came down in front of her. Strange, she thought, but she stopped and waited for the train, which didn't arrive. So she went out to reach the barrier to lift it up, but her hands went through it, and it disappeared, to reveal a hole in the snow and a huge sheer drop right in front of her. According to Jackie, she then turned to her right and continued to walk, but the same phenomena happened again. Another railway-level crossing barrier, stopping Jackie from plummeting down another sheer drop. Again, she changed direction and continued walking, but daylight was running out once again, and the wind was now gusting at around 90 miles per hour, driving temperatures down to an astonishing minus 40 degrees. Whatever was looking out for Jackie earlier in the day would surely abandon her now, and with no energy left, no way of knowing where she was, and no idea where the rescue teams were, she decided to stop and lie down, completely aware that this decision might be her last. As she lay on her back on the mountain, seemingly preparing herself for death, she suddenly became aware that she was walking again, completely normally, with no feeling of cold or pain, no whiteout conditions or howling winds. The landscape was a stunning contrast of colourful flowers, blue skies, blue bridges, crystal clear lakes, all enveloped in a type of warm neon blue light. Jackie was in a land of beauty and calm, and this was where she wanted to stay. Meanwhile, somewhere else on the mountain, the rescue teams were forced to call off the search again for a second night running. As they all returned to base camp, they were fully aware that the chances of finding Jackie alive were quickly running out, and as far as they knew, she could have already succumbed to weather conditions or worse, the injuries of her fall. Back to the blizzard on the mountain, and Jackie had suddenly gained a burst of energy, as if this strange land which she's being shown had forced her to take control of her life again and fight for her own survival. She began to vigorously dig into the snow to create a shelter, and as she crawled inside and lay there, she had a strange feeling that everything would be okay. But she knew that she couldn't fall asleep. Giving into sleep would be fatal. Morning arrived once more, and the rescue team's efforts were doubled down. RAF helicopters were now in the air, scouring the mountains for any sign of Jackie. Specialist search and rescue dogs now joined an increased number of people, all hoping to find Jackie alive. But even as they continued to search, it was becoming more likely that they would be looking for her body. As Jackie emerged from her shelter, cold, weary, and completely exhausted, she still had absolutely no idea where she was, or which way was the safest route down the mountain. That is, until the strange light appeared once again. This time, it appeared to illuminate a V-shaped pathway above her. Jackie grabbed her compass and noted the direction of the light and the pathway and began to walk. A little while later, she saw a dog running towards her, which began to lick her hands and bark almost constantly. This was followed by the search and rescue team, who'd spotted her from a distance and sent the dog to her. Jackie was now safe, and most importantly, she was alive. According to the mountain rescue team members, it's obvious why Jackie survived. She had the determination, mentally and physically, to fight the effects of the weather, the conditions, and the rugged environment. But was there also some other reason? We need to go all the way back to the first pin we dropped earlier in this episode. We were discussing the neocortex, a part of the brain which is responsible for sensory perception, movement, language, episodic memory, consciousness, and in Eben Alexander's case, it was stated that his neocortex couldn't have possibly had any part to play in his near-death experience. Now, to be absolutely clear, I'm no brain surgeon or neuroscientist, but there are so many in the profession who feel that an NDE can be easily explained. Studies have shown that the neocortex is more than capable of generating these vivid and heaven-like visions during an NDE. Brain activity across this area has been recorded in scientific experiments, and what's more than that, these experiments can be duplicated in the lab, and have shown staggeringly eerie similarities to those who have had full-on NDE episodes. Many skeptics will stand by their opinion that an NDE is the product of a dying brain, with billions of nerves and sensors firing all sorts of messages throughout the body and mind. As already stated, it's been proven that the neocortex can still be more than active when it seems that the brain is dead. So it's very likely that these visions of tunnels with lights at the end of them, the beautiful landscapes with colourful flowers and vivid waterfalls, the meeting of long-dead relatives and loved ones, could actually be the product of a confused and dying brain, which in itself is actually fighting to survive. Many military pilots and test pilots have reported very similar experiences when in training, especially when they're being subjected to extreme gravitational forces. Temporary cerebral ischemia is the brief loss of blood to the brain which many military pilots in both training and in actual flight action can experience. The side effects of this condition are tunnel vision, bright lights, out-of-body experiences. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But does this explanation fit the cause for all near-death experiences? Probably not. But just like the alien abduction phenomenon, there are striking similarities from case to case. But near-death experiences have one huge difference from that of incidents of alien abduction. The similarities are experienced through the brain itself. So we have to begin by asking the question, is this something that the brain has evolved into doing over the course of thousands and thousands of years of evolution? The complexities of the human brain are still very misunderstood, and while science strives to push the boundaries of understanding this collection of neurons, we're still not sure how the brain actually works. The average human brain has around 86 billion neurons, which is strangely the approximate number of stars in our own galaxy, the Milky Way, and all of these neurons are connected to each other by bridges, for want of a better word, which have differing molecular switches. These bridges are called synapses, and if you think that 86 billion is a large number, then you'll be blown away by the estimated number of synapses in the brain, around 1 quadrillion. That's the number 1 followed by 15 zeros. The more we delve into the makeup of the brain, the more complicated it gets. Blood vessels, different types of neurons, as well as different types of synapses, cells known as glia, which are somewhat of a mystery themselves. The list goes on. The average human brain weighs around 1,350 grams and is made up of approximately 60% fat, with the other 40% consisting of proteins, carbohydrates, water, and salts. It's astonishing to even think that this strange mass of matter can compute calculations to send man to the moon, can enable skilled surgeons to perform life-saving operations, can be able to write beautiful works of poetry, plays, books, music, create art. There doesn't seem to be an end to its abilities. But those abilities can also manifest in the form of hurt, violence, killing, torture, murder. You only have to reel off a few names to see just how differently our brains can make us behave. Jeffrey Dahmer, Harold Shipman, Cambodian tyrant Pol Pot, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler. We could go on and on and on. The brain is still a very mysterious organ in the most simplest of terms. And if you consider what you have just heard as a small example of the sheer randomness of the people and personalities that are controlled by this collection of nerves, blood vessels, cells, and all of the other matter contained within, then is it too much of a stretch to believe or consider that the brain may be operating at a higher level of consciousness and understanding, which we are simply too primitive to even grasp? The skeptics will say that these NDEs are the miscellaneous and random firings of the brain's nerves and senses, trying to make sense of what is happening to it. This is why so many NDEs follow very similar patterns: the tunnel, the light, the vivid, colourful, beautiful landscapes, the loved ones coming to greet us, the messages which are delivered to tell us to go back, that it's not our time, that we have unfinished business. But there could also be another set of possibilities at work here. Maybe the reason that many of the experiences which those have reported during an NDE are so similar is because there are such places beyond our world. Whether they are the heaven-like environments or the depths of darkness and flames, could there actually be dimensions where our lost loved ones now reside? Dimensions that are only available at the point of near death? Does the brain's complexity and power of consciousness somehow expand to such a huge degree that these dimensions then become visible? within our mind's eye. The big question then becomes one which has stumped the human race since its very beginning. Is there life after death? And have these NDE experiences seen it, whichever form it takes? Not all NDEs are the same, and the ones which you've just heard only go to prove that. How can one person become detached from their body and float above their hospital bed, meet up with a grandmother and be told that it isn't their time, to another whose near-death experience started off in a realm of darkness and incomprehensible noise, to yet another who somehow made it down a mountain against all of the odds? Why did Jackie see those strange railway-level crossing barriers when she was lost in a whiteout condition? Barriers that saved her life, more than once. What forces were driving those visions, and were they the same ones which took her away as she lay in the darkness, about to succumb to the cold and exhaustion which had slowly taken a hold of her? Is there evidence that the brain's activity increases during and after death? Well, yes, there is. In 2014, a woman from Michigan in the US was hailed as one of the most incredible and curious medical cases in the world. At just 24 years old and pregnant with her third child, she collapsed at her home of a suspected seizure. Her mother, who was with her, immediately called emergency services, who raced to the house to attend to her, but by this time, she'd been unconscious for around 10 minutes, and paramedics had quickly discovered that she wasn't breathing. Her life was in the balance during the ambulance ride, and things were made even worse when it became clear that the hospital which she was being taken to for treatment didn't have the facilities needed for her condition. She was then taken to the emergency department at the University of Michigan Hospital, where her heart was shocked back into beating 3 times. But she fell unconscious and was placed on life support in the neurointensive care unit, where doctors were carefully monitoring her brain activity. The patient's medical records revealed that she'd also been diagnosed with a heart problem during her 2 other pregnancies, and this heart condition resulted in seizures and blackouts. Now in a deep coma, doctors were not just keeping a close eye on their physical checks of their patient, but also the data coming from the life support systems, and neither were good. After around 3 days of zero response to both physical and mental stimuli, the prospect was put forward to the family of the patient's life support systems being switched off. As far as the doctors were concerned, the only reason their patient was still alive was down to the life support systems. Brain activity had completely ceased, and there wasn't any sign whatsoever that the brain was functioning. After more tests, it was confirmed that the patient wouldn't recover, no matter what treatment was administered. The difficult decision was finally made by her family, and medical staff were instructed to switch off all life support systems, stop the flow of oxygen to her, and remove her breathing tube. It's now at this point that many would have just expected their loved one to silently and painlessly slip away, probably one of the best ways possible. But something else began to happen, something which turned this routine procedure into a complete conundrum as far as what was expected to happen to the brain. Professor of neurology at the University of Michigan, Jeanette Atkinson, had been desperately searching for data and cases of profound NDEs for decades. To her, the question of life after death, or what happens at the point of dying, was still in its infancy, and had scientifically all but come to a standstill. She pored over case after case of cardiac arrest patient testimony of out-of-body experiences, the feeling of being beckoned towards a bright light, the reunion with long-dead loved ones and friends, the message of hope and unfinished business which needed to be taken care of, the effort that must be put into becoming a better, more positive person, not just for themselves or family and friends, but for the whole world, to fulfill a purpose. But were any of these things actually happening at the time of death? Jimo very much doubted it. After all, she'd conducted experiments in her own laboratory, which consisted of monitoring rats as their hearts were stopped and their oxygen supply ran out. Under these controlled conditions, the brains of the rats displayed a huge amount of activity, including neurotransmitters serotonin and dopamine firing off signals at a dramatic rate. So was this what was happening to humans when they reported coming back from the dead with detailed NDEs? As Jimo began studying the case of the patient in Michigan, she quickly realized that our own understanding of the process of death had all but stalled. Resuscitation procedures had come so far since the 1960s that bringing someone back from the brink after their heart had stopped for not just a few minutes, but for much, much longer, was now very much taken for granted. Up to a staggering 20% of those people who were resuscitated had experienced some sort of NDE, and a respectable number of those were even able to recall with detail watching doctors and medical staff working on their bodies from above. Around 1 in 10 people have some sort of near-death experience. That's approximately 800 million people who could have quite possibly seen a dimension which exists beyond death. It's just like those of us who have seen a ghost. Hundreds of millions of witnesses. Are they all mistaken or lying? In the 1970s, a group of doctors and specialists whose fields of expertise were in both the physical and mental aspects of the human body gathered together to study the phenomena of these NDEs. Their whole purpose of study was to prove that human consciousness could survive completely independently of the brain. For over 30 years, this group and others associated with it collected thousands and thousands of detailed witness testimony. Resuscitation specialist Professor Sam Parnia even stated, quote, "We are now at the point where we have both the tools and the means to scientifically answer the age-old question, what happens when we die?" End quote. But even his studies didn't significantly push the boundaries of understanding the process of death and its after-effects further forward. It was 2015, almost a full year after the data which had been recorded during the Michigan patient's life support systems had been switched off, that Professor Jimo Borjanin began to study the phenomena of near-death experiences from the point of view of the electrical activity that the brain was displaying. Along with a number of colleagues, Jimo discovered a number of startling and seemingly impossible instances of the brain continuing to function after it had been cut off from its oxygen supply. In the case of the Michigan patient, as soon as her oxygen had been switched off, the brain went into a state of intense activity. For 2 whole minutes, there was clear evidence that sections of the brain which controlled the majority of our cognitive functions, including memory, began to synchronize, began to communicate with each other, but at a much higher level than normal. This surge in activity briefly lulled for around 18 seconds, but then quickly returned for another 4 minutes, then lulled again for another minute, only to return for an astonishing 3rd time. After this period had ended, the brain was truly dead, and the Michigan patient had sadly passed away. But the extent of electrical activity which was clearly abundant in her brain after her oxygen supply had been cut off was showing that all of the conscious functions which the brain controls during our normal moments of life were staggeringly alive and well. To a trained outsider, who could only see the data recorded from brain's activity, they would have had no idea that the Michigan patient was actually dead. It was Professor Borjanin who was left pondering a very profound and important question. Had the Michigan patient experienced an incredibly intense NDE? And had they actually traveled to the other side of death and stayed there, leaving the vessel behind which used to be their body? Because of the Michigan patient not surviving their condition, these questions can never be answered. But Professor Bourgeois is confident and hopeful that with funding and further research, science can develop a much deeper understanding of what is actually going on when the brain begins to fire off huge amounts of neurological data when it is on the verge of death. But even as we bring this episode to a close, we have to ask ourselves as a species, do we really have the moral right to mess with death, to interfere with it, to cut it open as a surgeon would to repair a physical injury? If the veil of life and death does exist, and we are able to cross over it to begin a new existence in the afterlife, then should we really be tampering with that process? Should this be something that needs to be left well alone, for the good of us all? The human race has strived to make discoveries in all areas of science, whether that be by choice or by accident, and it's very difficult to see a day where this won't be the case. But maybe with the phenomena of near-death experiences, we should heed the warnings from research which has already been conducted, and also from the minds of those in Hollywood. In 2019, an experiment conducted at Yale University revealed that the brain may be able to continue to show signs of activity hours after death. Scientists had gained permission to use the decapitated heads of pigs after slaughter for a series of experiments. The brains of the pigs were removed and stimulated after being immersed in a cocktail of synthetic blood, which was combined with a number of drugs. Amazingly, a number of the brains began to show signs of metabolic activity, as well as a number of synapses, those bridges which join all of the neurons of the brain together, beginning to also fire off messages. Granted, this wasn't anywhere near the activity as seen in the brain of the Michigan patient, but it did go some way to prove that death may not be the final end to the body or the brain. Way back in 1985, Wes Craven directed a made-for-TV movie called Chiller. It was the story of Miles Crichton, who died of a condition which, at the time, medical science couldn't treat. Placed in cryogenic suspension for over 10 years, a malfunction in his cryogenic pod caused the process of Miles' body to begin to thaw out. Because of the family's wealth, his doting mother instructed surgeons to operate on her son and save him, using methods which weren't available at the time of his death. Not only was the cryogenic reversal a success, but also the surgery to treat the condition which had claimed his life in the first place. But it wasn't long before those around him realized that something wasn't quite right. Miles fires the man which kept his family's company running and successful. He influences a heart attack to kill him. He turns against those who once looked out for him, and begins to undertake a series of grisly murders. Miles was brought back from the dead, yes, but the very thing that made him the person he was before his death, his mind, his consciousness, his soul, his life force, his personality, whatever you want to call it, didn't come back. Instead, Miles's body was inhabited by something which had attached itself to him, something which shouldn't have come back. Regardless of whether this is Hollywood fiction, cryogenic storage, for those who can afford it, is a very real occurrence, as is cryogenic reversal, albeit very problematic at the moment. There has been no occurrence of anything, be it human or animal, which has ever been brought back from cryogenic suspension, regardless of what the media says. And as far as our technological advancements in medical procedures are concerned, it won't be happening anytime soon. But that doesn't stop us from wondering if it's possible. And if it is, what questions would be asked to the first person ever to be brought back from the dead? Will they have seen that realm beyond which we live in, a realm which so many NDE witnesses swear they have walked in, spoken to loved ones long since gone, walked down that long tunnel towards the light, only to be turned back and told, "Now is not your time"? Just like any witness to a paranormal event, Those who have had a near-death experience have witnessed something which only they can describe. And until we have the tools and understanding of what is going on at the moment of death and beyond, we can only try to be open and accommodating, encouraging those witnesses to come forward and share their experiences. To bring this episode to a close, if you're a fan of the original cast of Star Trek, the fourth movie in the franchise, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, deals in part with the life, death, and rebirth of Mr. Spock. In a brief conversation, Dr. McCoy quizzes Spock about his experiences beyond death, and it's this conversation that I feel most accurately describes the huge void between those of us who question and those who have had the experience. McCoy: perhaps we could cover a little philosophical ground. Life, death, life, things of that nature. Spock: I didn't have time on Vulcan to review the philosophical disciplines. McCoy: come on, Spock, it's me, McCoy. You really have gone where no man's gone before. Can't you tell me what it felt like? Spock: it would be impossible to discuss the subject without a common frame of reference. McCoy: you're joking. Spock: a joke is a story with a humorous climax. McCoy: you mean I have to die to discuss your insights on death? Spock: forgive me, Doctor. I'm receiving a number of distress calls. McCoy: I don't doubt it. Coming up on episode 72 of the Haunted UK podcast. Anyway, now things got genuinely scary, and we quickly forgot all about the bathroom. From downstairs, we clearly heard the noise of somebody entering the building through the kitchen. These sounds were unmistakable, clearly audible, and very, very real. Being the nearest one to the bookroom door, I slowly and quietly pushed it shut, and then sat with my back against it while Jim and Brad sat against the far wall on the opposite side of the room. The fear we felt at that moment was solely based on us getting into trouble for trespassing. Jim's unexplained experience, which happened just seconds previously, had really spooked us, but by now, our thoughts and fears were firmly fixed on the inevitable telling off that we were about to receive.